Hi, I'm Quint F. Kamba, author of a book or two, YouTube student of the grand orator Professor PLO, the great philosopher and teacher Mr. Joshua Mapanga, and the great African queen Dr. Arikana, and so many other illustrious Africans. The other day, I stumbled upon a news story that shook me to my core. It detailed the horrific murder of two young beautiful black African women in South Africa by white farmers. Their bodies were mutilated, their dignity stripped away, and then, as a final act of barbarity, they were fed to the farmers' pigs. The sheer cruelty, the utter disregard for human life left me grappling with a single searing question: what could possibly drive a human being to commit such a heinous act against another? Racism. It's a word that carries the weight of centuries of pain, oppression, and injustice. It's a stain on the fabric of humanity, a testament to our capacity for cruelty and division. But racism is more than just a word. It's a system, a deeply ingrained belief system that asserts the superiority of one race over another. This belief manifests in countless ways, from overt prejudice and discrimination to more subtle forms of systemic oppression that permeate every aspect of society. It's a system that has been built and maintained over generations, often through violence, coercion, and the manipulation of power. We'll peel back the layers of this complex issue, examining its historical foundations and how it continues to rear its ugly head in the 21st century. We'll explore the psychological roots of racism, delving into the ways in which fear, ignorance, and the pursuit of power contribute to its persistence. Our goal is not just to understand racism, but to dismantle it. By shining a light on its insidious workings, we can begin to challenge the beliefs, attitudes, and structures that perpetuate it. To understand the monster of racism, we must trace its footsteps through history. Our journey begins in the shadows of antiquity, where we'll uncover the early manifestations of racial prejudice and discrimination. We'll explore the Arab slave trade, a brutal system that saw millions of Africans enslaved and subjected to unimaginable cruelty. We'll then turn our attention to the transatlantic slave trade, a horrific chapter in human history that saw millions more Africans forcibly transported to the Americas, where they endured centuries of enslavement and oppression. From there, we'll examine the rise of European colonialism, a system that exploited and oppressed people of color across the globe. We'll delve into the horrors of colonialism in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, exposing the brutal realities of forced labor, land theft, and cultural genocide. Our journey will also take us to South Africa, where we'll examine the rise and fall of apartheid, a system of racial segregation that brutalized black South Africans for decades. Through it all, we'll connect the dots, drawing a line from the atrocities of the past to the persistent inequalities of the present. When we think of slavery, our minds often go straight to the transatlantic slave trade. However, centuries before Europeans set foot in the Americas, the Arab world was already engaged in a massive, brutal trade of human beings. The Arab slave trade, which began as early as the 7th century, spanned over a millennium, leaving a devastating impact on Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Driven by economic, social, and political factors, millions of African men, women, and children were captured and enslaved. Enslaved Africans were forced into various roles, including domestic work, agricultural labor, military service, and administrative positions. Forced to march for months across deserts, many perished from exhaustion, disease, or starvation. Those who survived were sold in slave markets, stripped of their identities, and subjected to a life of servitude and brutality. Scars of enslavement, the Arab slave trade's impact on Africa. The Arab slave trade left an indelible mark on the African continent, its consequences echoing through generations. Beyond the sheer loss of life, the trade had a profound impact on African societies, economies, and demographics. It destabilized entire regions, fueled conflicts, and eroded trust between communities as some groups participated in the trade for their own gain. The constant raids and capture of its people depleted Africa's workforce, hindering economic and agricultural development. It also led to the displacement of communities and the destruction of social structures. The trans-Saharan trade routes, once vibrant centers of cultural exchange and commerce, became scarred by the slave trade's brutality. Furthermore, the Arab slave trade played a role in shaping racial perceptions and prejudices. The association of Africans with slavery contributed to the development of racist ideologies that were later used to justify European colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. The dehumanization of Africans, propagated through centuries of enslavement, had long-lasting consequences, influencing attitudes and policies towards Black people globally. Castration. Barbaric acts of the Arab slave trade. Among the many horrors of the Arab slave trade, the practice of castration stands out as a particularly cruel and dehumanizing act. Male slaves were often castrated not only as a form of punishment and control, but also to increase their value in certain markets. Eunuchs, as they were known, were sought after as servants in wealthy households and harems, perceived as less threatening and more docile. The procedure itself was brutal and often fatal. Performed without anesthesia or proper medical care, many died from infection, blood loss, or the trauma of the experience. Those who survived were left physically and emotionally scarred, their masculinity stripped away, their ability to have children stolen from them. Castration served as a chilling reminder of the absolute power that slave owners held over the bodies and lives of those they enslaved. This practice highlights the depths of dehumanization inherent in the system of slavery. To comprehend the barbarity of castration is to confront the reality that enslaved Africans were not seen as human beings, but as commodities to be bought, sold, and mutilated for profit. The Indian caste system, hierarchy, and discrimination. While the Arab slave trade ravaged Africa, the Indian caste system took root, establishing a rigid social hierarchy. Though not based on skin color, it often relegated darker-skinned individuals to the bottom, divided into 4 varnas: Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. Dalits outside this division faced extreme discrimination and segregation. The Aryans, light-skinned Indo-Europeans, are believed to have established the caste system. The Indian caste system is deeply unjust, rooted in baseless ideas that have no place in a modern, equitable society. It perpetuates discrimination and inequality, enforcing divisions that are completely irrational and harmful. The Indian caste system, despite its complexities, offers a crucial insight into the nature of racism. It's not always explicitly about skin color, but about constructing and maintaining social hierarchies that benefit one group over another. In this system, birth determined one's destiny, limiting opportunities for social mobility and perpetuating inequality. Dalits, often those with the darkest skin, faced severe prejudice and discrimination. They were relegated to the most menial and degrading jobs, denied access to education, and excluded from temples and social gatherings. The very shadow of a Dalit was considered polluting to upper caste individuals, highlighting the dehumanizing nature of this system. The caste system demonstrates how racism operates by creating an us versus them mentality, where differences, whether real or imagined, are used to justify discrimination and exploitation. It shows how power structures, once established, can be perpetuated through cultural norms, religious beliefs, and social practices, making them seem natural and immutable. The Arab slave trade was a prelude to a far larger, more systematic trade in human misery, the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were transported across the Atlantic, destined for forced labor on the plantations of the Americas. European powers engaged in ruthless competition for control of the slave trade. They established trading posts, forged alliances, and fueled tribal conflicts to secure human cargo. This was a trade in human lives, treated with less dignity than livestock. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was a nightmare of unimaginable suffering. Africans were crammed into the holds of slave ships, packed tightly together like sardines in a can. The air was thick with the stench of human waste, vomit, and disease. There was no space to move, no light, no fresh air. Many died during this horrific voyage, succumbing to disease, starvation, dehydration, or sheer despair. Those who survived often wished they hadn't. The trauma of the Middle Passage, the constant fear, the loss of dignity, The witnessing of unspeakable cruelty left deep scars on the souls of those who endured it. The cries of the suffering, the pleas for mercy, were met with indifference by the slave traders, who saw their human cargo as nothing more than a commodity to be delivered to market. The Middle Passage was a testament to the depths of human greed and the capacity for cruelty when profit is the driving force. Stolen lives, shattered dreams, life on the plantation. For those who survived the horrors of the Middle Passage, a new hell awaited them in the Americas. They were sold at auction, treated like livestock, their skills and abilities assessed, their bodies poked and prodded. They were stripped of their names, their languages, their cultures, and forced to assume new identities as slaves. Life on the plantation was one of relentless toil, brutal punishments, and the constant threat of violence. Slaves worked from dawn till dusk, their bodies pushed to their limits, their spirits broken by the lash. Families were often separated, mothers torn from their children, husbands from their wives. The bonds of kinship, so central to African societies, were ruthlessly severed. The plantation owners ruled with an iron fist, their authority absolute, their word law. Slaves had no rights, no voice, no recourse to justice. They were seen as property, chattel, to be used and abused at the whim of their masters. The iron mask of silence, crushing rebellion and identity. To maintain their control over the enslaved population, slave owners employed a system of brutal punishments designed not only to inflict pain, but also to crush any spirit of rebellion. Whippings, beatings, mutilations, and even murder were commonplace. The message was clear: any act of defiance, any attempt to assert one's humanity, would be met with swift and merciless retribution. Beyond physical violence, slave owners also engaged in a systematic campaign to erase the cultural identities of those they enslaved. Slaves were forbidden from speaking their native languages, practicing their traditional religions, or engaging in any cultural practices that might preserve their sense of self. This cultural genocide was just as damaging as the physical violence. It aimed to strip slaves of their history, their heritage, their very souls, leaving them with nothing but their subjugation. It was a way of controlling not just their bodies, but also their minds. Colorism, a tool of division within a divided people. As if the horrors of slavery weren't enough, a new evil emerged from the plantation system: colorism. This insidious form of discrimination created a hierarchy within the enslaved population, favoring those with lighter skin, often the product of rape by slave masters. Lighter-skinned slaves might be granted preferential treatment, given easier work, or even allowed to work inside the master's house, further separating them from their darker-skinned counterparts. This created a system of internalized oppression, where those with lighter skin might internalize the racist ideology of their oppressors, viewing themselves as superior to those with darker skin. Colorism served the interests of the slave owners by driving a wedge between the enslaved population, making it more difficult for them to unite against their common oppressor. It sowed the seeds of division and distrust, a legacy that continues to plague Black communities to this day. Section 6, Scars on the Soul, the transatlantic slave trade's lasting legacy. The transatlantic slave trade may have ended in the 19th century, but its legacy continues to cast a long shadow over the world today. The centuries of slavery and oppression have left deep scars on Black communities globally, manifesting in systemic inequalities, generational trauma, and persistent racism. The economic disparities, the lack of access to quality education and healthcare, the overrepresentation of Black people in the criminal justice system, these are all directly linked to the legacy of slavery. The trauma of the past continues to echo through generations, impacting everything from mental health to family structures. The transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity of unimaginable proportions. It's a stain on our collective conscience, a reminder of the dark side of human nature, but it's also a call to action. We must confront this history honestly and unflinchingly, acknowledge its lasting impact, and work tirelessly to dismantle the systems of oppression that continue to perpetuate its legacy. European colonialism, a global legacy of exploitation. As the transatlantic slave trade waned, European colonialism emerged, driven by economic greed and nationalist ambition. European powers subjugated vast swaths of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, exploiting resources and people to fuel their industrial revolutions. They carved up continents with little regard for cultural boundaries or the rights of indigenous populations. Colonialism was built on racism, justifying brutal treatment and cultural destruction. The Congo's agony. King Leopold II's reign of terror. In the Congo, under King Leopold II of Belgium, unimaginable cruelty was inflicted in the pursuit of profit. Leopold's primary interest was rubber, leading to a system of forced labor with Congolese people working under threat of torture and death. Villages were raided, hostages taken, and quotas imposed, with horrific punishments for those who failed to meet them. Whippings, amputations, and death were common, resulting in millions of Congolese deaths. Their lives were sacrificed at the altar of greed. Dividing and conquering. The scars of colonial rule. Colonial powers exploited ethnic and tribal tensions, creating hierarchies based on race and ethnicity. This divide and conquer strategy left lasting scars, fueling ethnic conflicts, political instability, and economic disparities. Beyond physical violence, colonialism inflicted deep psychological wounds, leading to a loss of identity and self-worth. Apartheid in South Africa, a system built on hate. Apartheid in South Africa enforced white supremacy through racial segregation from 1948 to 1994. Black South Africans were stripped of their rights, forced into segregated townships, and denied access to quality education, healthcare, and economic opportunities. They were trapped in a cycle of poverty and oppression, while white South Africans enjoyed the fruits of their labor. The psychological scars of apartheid, internalized oppression, and its legacy. The legacy of apartheid extends beyond its official end, with ongoing racial tensions and economic disparities. Internalized oppression leads to self-doubt and low self-esteem among Black South Africans. Overcoming this legacy requires confronting past trauma, challenging racist attitudes, and building a society based on equality and justice. It's a journey that South Africa and the world is still navigating. The unseen chains, modern racism, and its subtle forms. Racism has evolved into more insidious forms operating beneath the surface. Modern racism manifests in subtle biases, microaggressions, and systemic inequalities in education, employment, healthcare, and housing. Everyday realities of modern racism include being passed over for promotions or followed in stores due to race. These subtle forms of racism chip away at self-esteem and opportunities, perpetuating inequality. The legacy of past systems continues to shape our world. A system of control. Racism in the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system disproportionately targets and punishes people of color, particularly Black people. Black Americans are incarcerated at higher rates, more likely to be stopped and searched, and receive harsher sentences. This systemic bias results from centuries of racist policies, creating a two-tiered justice system. The criminal justice system has become a tool for maintaining racial control and perpetuating inequality. Economic apartheid. The persistence of inequality. Systemic racism creates barriers to economic opportunity, trapping people of color in poverty. Disparities in wealth, education, and employment persist, with marginalized communities facing significant challenges. The playing field is not level, and the rules are rigged against those historically oppressed. The media plays a powerful role in shaping perceptions of race and ethnicity. Harmful stereotypes about people of color are often perpetuated, influencing beliefs and behavior. The media underrepresents people of color in positions of power, reinforcing the notion of whiteness as the norm. This lack of representation and perpetuation of stereotypes contribute to ongoing racism. Education is key to breaking the cycle of racism and creating a more just world. We need to educate ourselves and future generations about the history and impact of racism. Education must challenge biases, empower individuals, and foster empathy and understanding. It can help build a society based on equality, justice, and respect for all. Racism is a global issue, manifesting in different forms and contexts. From the caste system in India to the plight of indigenous communities, racism takes on many faces. It's a global problem that demands a global solution, requiring solidarity and action. We must broaden our lens and examine racism's manifestations across the globe. The fight for racial justice requires a shared commitment from all corners of the world. The enduring grip of caste discrimination against Dalits in India. Despite legal reforms, caste-based discrimination continues to affect millions, particularly Dalits. Dalits face social exclusion, economic marginalization, and violence based on their birth. They are often relegated to menial jobs, trapped in poverty and social stigma. Dismantling caste discrimination requires a fundamental shift in attitudes and beliefs. The shadow of slavery, racism against black Africans in India. The descendants of enslaved Africans, known as Siddhis, face discrimination and marginalization. Their African features and darker skin make them targets of prejudice and stereotypes. They are often denied opportunities in education and employment, facing social exclusion. The experiences of black Africans in India highlight the ongoing impact of slavery and colonialism. Xenophobia and the other fueling racism across borders. Racism often finds fertile ground in societies grappling with globalization and migration. Prejudices and fears of the other can lead to xenophobia, discrimination, and violence. Xenophobia continues to fuel conflict, displacement, and human rights abuses worldwide. A global call to action dismantling racism in all its forms. Confronting racism requires a multifaceted approach and shared responsibility. This includes education, policy change, economic empowerment, representation, and solidarity. Education must challenge stereotypes and foster empathy. Policy changes should promote equity and equal opportunity. Economic empowerment involves investing in marginalized communities and supporting minority-owned businesses. The fight against racism requires sustained effort and a commitment to creating a just world. The media's responsibility shaping perceptions, challenging bias. The media wields immense power in shaping societal perceptions of race. Sadly, this power has often reinforced harmful stereotypes. The images and stories we consume contribute to a collective understanding of race. Black people are disproportionately shown as perpetrators of crime. Their humanity is often stripped away in favor of sensationalized headlines. This skewed representation fuels implicit bias and justifies discrimination. However, the media can also dismantle these harmful narratives. By showcasing diversity and challenging stereotypes, the media can become a force for positive change. Education, the antidote to ignorance and prejudice. If the media holds the power to shape perceptions, then education holds the key to transforming minds. Education is the antidote to ignorance, the weapon against prejudice, and the foundation upon which a more just and equitable society can be built. We need an education system that goes beyond sanitized textbooks and superficial narratives, a system that grapples with the uncomfortable truths of history, that examines the systemic nature of racism, and that empowers students to become critical thinkers and agents of change. This means teaching the history of slavery and colonialism not as isolated events, but as interconnected systems that continue to shape our world today. It means examining the ways in which racism manifests in our institutions, our policies, and even in our everyday interactions. Imagine classrooms where students engage in open and honest dialogues about race, where they learn to challenge their own biases, and where they develop a deep understanding of the interconnectedness of our shared humanity. This is the transformative power of an education system committed to dismantling racism. We've seen how racism can fuel violent crimes against innocent and marginalized people, how it destroys the lives of so many by denying opportunity and limiting social mobility. We must make a conscious choice every day to challenge injustice and work toward building a more equitable world. Recognize our interconnected destinies and shared humanity. Listen to and believe the lived experiences of the marginalized. Challenge racist jokes, call out microaggressions, and hold leaders accountable. Use our privilege to amplify marginalized voices in the workplace and every institution and dismantle oppression. Let us shape a future where racism is eradicated and consigned to history, because the alternative is catastrophic.